As we're getting ready to begin, Don Vanderhule is going to be our primary presenter. And as the screen is showing, we're going to be focusing on delayed or denied evaluations and compensatory services. There is a slide deck, this slide deck, and a notice on the TEA website where you would find this webinar available for you. Also, you are welcome to add questions to the Q&A, and those will be considered for and reviewed for next steps. So with that, Dawn.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dawn Vanderhule, the Child Find and Evaluation Coordinator in the Division of Special Education Program Technical Assistance. I work with the Child Find Evaluation and Art Supports Network. Today's webinar will provide information to assist admission, review, and dismissal committees in appropriately considering the provision of compensatory services for a student with an individualized education program, otherwise known as an IEP, who has not provided timely access to special education and related services due to an initial delay or denial in conducting an evaluation. This guidance provided today is in response to ongoing corrective actions from the U.S. Department of Education. On our next slide, we have our copyright notice. Please note this presentation is copyrighted by the Texas Education Agency. If you have any questions or need any further information, please contact copyrights@tea.texas.gov. On our next slide, we see compensatory services documents. TEA has recently posted 2 different guidance documents on delayed or denied evaluations and compensatory services. One is intended for ARD committees and the other is specific to families. Today, we will primarily walk through the document intended to provide information to ARD committees. Both documents are currently posted on the TEA website. We will also post the links here for the webinar audience. Our next slide says compensatory services. So let's begin by identifying just what are compensatory services. Compensatory services are generally defined as educational services that a student needs to make up for progress or skills lost because a local education agency did not provide the student with a free and appropriate public education known as FAPE. On this next slide, we're going to talk about some situations where an evaluation being delayed or denied could result in the need for the LEA to consider compensatory services. First is when a student is denied a timely initial evaluation, but is later found eligible for special education and related services. In other words, when the initial evaluation is not completed within timelines. When the initial evaluation is late and it results in a delay in the implementation of the student's IEP, compensatory services may be needed. LEAs have tracking systems that would readily identify students who are not provided a timely evaluation. This scenario occurred more frequently in the 1920 and 2021 school years due to COVID-19 disruptions that it made it more challenging for LEAs to complete evaluations within timelines. Regardless of the reason for the evaluation delay, the ARD committee should consider if compensatory services are needed, like initial evaluations. Also note that if a reevaluation is delayed and the student is later found to be eligible for new special education or related services, Then the ARD committee should consider if there is a need for compensatory services. Another evaluation situation is when an LEA denies or refuses to conduct an initial evaluation when it should not have. The student is later found eligible for special education, and as a result, there is a gap between when the LEA first should have evaluated the child and when the student was ultimately evaluated and an IEP developed. Students in this situation are more difficult to identify than the ones for whom timelines were missed. These are cases where there's a claim made or other information that indicates the student should have been evaluated sooner, but was not. In these situations, the ARD committee should consider if there is a need for compensatory services. Let's move now to the next slide. Now we will talk about how schools provide compensatory education services. ARD committees have latitude in determining the form of compensatory services that will be provided. The key is that the ARD committee makes decisions on a case-by-case basis, and that they consider what compensatory services will remedy or make up for the failure to provide FAPE. As you can see from this slide, options for providing compensatory services, there is flexibility for when compensatory services can be provided. This is not an exhaustive list of the possible options, but provides some possibilities. There are decisions to be made around when, as well as who provides the services. On this next slide, you see compensatory services and a visual for least restrictive environment. If compensatory services are to be provided during the school day, the student's least restrictive environment cannot be altered due to the provision of compensatory education services. A note of caution when providing compensatory services during the school day. Be mindful that the student's LRE cannot be altered due to the provision of the compensatory education services. In other words, providing compensatory services cannot negatively impact the student's access to and participation in the general education classroom with peers who do not have disabilities. Remember, the ARD committee decides if compensatory services are needed and what those services will be. Let's discuss some guidelines for ARD committees in making those decisions. Determinations about compensatory services are made based on the totality of the circumstances for each individual student. So when does the ARD committee consider compensatory services? As part of the initial ARD meeting to develop the IEP if a student was previously denied or an evaluation, or if the evaluation was late, or anytime the need for compensatory services is raised, the ARD committee should consider the need as soon as possible, but in no case later than the next ARD committee meeting. The ARD committee will consider, let's begin with the length of time. How long was the evaluation delayed? Or how much time passed between the denial of an evaluation that should not have been denied and the initial evaluation and an admission ARD meeting. In other words, what is the length of time when the student was denied FAPE? When we look at the next graphic, ARD committees will need to consider the amount and type of special education and related services the student did not receive. Also consider accommodations, modifications, or other supports that were not provided. The ARD committee will also consider any non-special education supports, services, or interventions that were provided. This information is helpful for the ARD committee in thinking about how the student was impacted as a result of not having an IEP implemented. It's part of considering the totality of the student's overall circumstances. Decisions about compensatory services should be data-based. The ARD committee will review student data and progress during the time that the student should have been, but was not receiving special education services. When determining whether a student needs compensatory services, the student's ARD committee must review the student's past and current needs, considering the absence of special education and related services resulting from delayed or denied evaluations. In reviewing data, the ARD committee should discuss and weigh information from a variety of sources. For example, the committee could gather data from progress monitoring of any general education interventions, student work samples, state assessments or benchmark results, universal screening data, report card progress, attendance and discipline data, teacher observations, and parent or guardian information. Use data to carefully consider, was the student making progress? In other words, is there evidence of student growth? And was the gap between the student's skills and grade level expectations increasing or decreasing? In other words, was the student catching up to peers or falling further behind? ARD committees will review that collected data and consider if the data indicates that the student was making individual progress during the time frame that the evaluation was delayed or denied. They will also look at the data to determine if, during the time the student was not receiving FAPE, the gap between the student's skills and grade level expectations was getting bigger or smaller. It will be important to gather data that shows the student catching up to peers or falling further behind. This data review and analysis will help the ARD committee to better understand how not having special education services impacted the student. Existing skill deficits. ARD committees need to consider whether there are indications that the student fell further behind, whether academically or non-academically, when special education and related services were not provided. Were existing skill deficits made worse when compared to grade level expectations as a result of not receiving services? If this is the case, it is likely the student will need compensatory services. The ARD committee, as we talk about a description of compensatory services now, the ARD committee must consider and, as applicable, include in the student's IEP the type, amount, location, duration, and frequency of the services the student will be provided to make up for lost special education related services. The decision about providing compensatory services should not be misconstrued to necessarily require an hour for hour or minute for minute makeup in services. The art committee will want to clearly communicate the amount of instruction and time required for compensatory services so that parents and guardians, as members of the art committee, can be well-informed participants in the decision-making process. So this next slide takes us to the art committee needs to think about. We need to think about how to reduce the impact of missed services, as well as ways to accelerate the student's progress, rather than simply making up for service minutes that were not provided. The art committee should think about ways to reduce or mitigate the impact of missed services and how the student's progress can be accelerated instead of thinking about ways to make up for minutes that were not provided. Remember that providing compensatory services does not necessarily mean that every minute of services that was not provided needs to be made up. Think more about how to reduce the impact of missing those services to accelerate progress. Art committees must carefully consider student and the family's input when determining how and when compensatory services will be provided. Overloading a student with compensatory services on top of existing services may ultimately do more harm than good. Likewise, removing a student too often from the routine settings, peers, and classes to provide them with compensatory services may have a negative impact on the student's social and educational progress. The art committee should consult with the student as appropriate about how best to deliver compensatory services. After determining compensatory services, we're now going to talk about monitoring implementation of services and revising those services as appropriate. Following the art committee's initial determination regarding compensatory services, the team should monitor and revise as appropriate those services with the objective of reasonably bringing the student to the levels he or she would have been without the disruption of a delayed or denied evaluation. The art committee should consider the monitoring process and methods that will meet the needs of the student and the student's family. How will the family know when all the compensatory services have been provided? And now a slide. Please remember, as we're considering all of these topics, an LEA must not suggest, encourage, or pressure families to waive special education services for students, including compensatory services. On this next slide, we have provided some guidance documents, as well as we have the delayed evaluations and compensatory services for art committees, and we have delayed evaluations and compensatory services for families. This concludes our webinar. We thank you for joining us today. You can always contact TEA at special education at tea.texas.gov. Any questions you've submitted will be carefully reviewed. This webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the TEA website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dawn, and the rest of the team. As noted earlier, the slide deck you just viewed and a notice that's affiliated with this is on the website. Our next meeting will be on November 18th. And I think that's it. Thank you all very much for attending.